call me heretic, say I've lost my way, claim I'm deceived, led astray by the day. Gnostics, Masons, live they spin, but I stand in truth with Christ within. No 501c chains can hold my soul. The Spirit's fire has made me whole. Through slander and scorn, I'll walk this road. My heart's secure in the Savior's
I'll
code.
see you at the great white throne judgment, where truth will shine and lies are undone. Every knee will bow, every heart made known. I'll stand with my King at the great white throne.
I'll stand you at the great white throne. Yeah. They whisper delusions, say my mind's gone, but I see the light where the shadows are drawn. The season of deception is short, it will fade. My faith's built on rock, not the games they've played. False accusers rise, but I won't bend. My hope's in Christ, my beginning and end. With joy I press on, His grace my defense. The truth will prevail in His holy presence.
I'll see you at the great white throne judgment, where truth will shine and lies are undone. Every knee will bow, every heart made known. I'll stand with my King at the great white throne.
No fear in my heart,
No doubt in my soul.
the Lamb's book of life
is where I'm enrolled.
Your words may cut,
But they'll never define.
my Savior's the judge.
And His verdict is mine.
Yeah.
I'll see you at the great white throne judgment, where truth will shine and lies are undone. Every knee will bow, every heart made known. I'll stand with my King at the great white throne.
So call me what you will, I'll carry this
I'll
load.
carry this load.
My eyes on the prize, where His glory's bestowed.
Glory's bestowed.
At the great white throne, we'll all stand in awe.
Stand in awe.
I worship my King. Fuck the great white throne. Yeah.
Greetings, brethren. I come to you today with another message in love, not condemnation or judgment. Understand, for the first 6 years of my faith, I was led to believe there was only one interpretation of eschatology, or the study of end times. I then learned about the Reformation, all the different doctrines, the confessions of faith, the reason why we have 40,000 denominations at modern times. But the point is, I was never taught that there was alternative interpretations. I was only taught that there was that one interpretation, and I was constantly being led to believe that current events were the fulfillment of various revelation-based prophecies. Because I am aware of the controller's plan in the future through various psychological operations to destroy the faiths of both atheists and Christians simultaneously. And today, the number of teachers, influencers that are teaching this one position without educating on the other positions, I believe, are setting up my brethren to be spiked like a volleyball. Because should your eschatology of futurism, premillennialism, dispensationalism, or any of the other futurist-based eschatologies, if those should fail to come to fruition and you have not educated yourselves on the alternative and accepted positions within the church as well as the non-accepted ones, you may lose communications, you may lose access to research by this point, and you may very well be convinced that your entire faith was based on a lie. So I'm pleading with you to please educate yourself so that you will not be deceived. And please do not come from a position of pride, because I hear it all the time. Oh, I won't be deceived. I'm the elect. I can't be deceived. Well, most of, I'd say 90% of the church today believes in an anti-scriptural version of cosmology because man told them that's what it is from a very young age. Even in the crib, they put a little solar system mobile above your crib. But 90% of the church believes in a cosmology based on man science. So when someone tells me that they can't be deceived, even if they're awake to that cosmology, most of their life they were fully under deception. Still being lied to today about modern events, whether it's the largest terror attack that ever happened on U.S. soil, right? We still don't know the full truth about that. So technically, we are deceived. So please don't come from a place of pride, because everybody knows what comes after that, the fall. So please come with me on a little history lesson so that you can hopefully educate yourself on other positions, other interpretations, so that the enemy's plans to quite literally destroy your faith in the future do not succeed. And that hopefully you will remember this heretic who's lost all touch with reality and hold on to faith, hold on to hope, and ultimately just trust his plan. Because his plan in Revelation 20 was to release the enemy, to deceive the nations, and that he has done and is currently doing. But this deception goes back a very long time. And I'm about to show you all the people who have led untold numbers of Christians to lose their faith because they thought these events were coming. They were guaranteed that these modern events, current events during their time, were for sure revelatory events. And if anybody's teaching you or leading you and somehow claiming that they know now, after centuries of men who have come before them doing the exact same thing and leading people astray, I would caution you about that person's pride in their finite understanding, because they're claiming that somehow they have some special revelation better than the last 3 centuries of men who came before them. All right, so come with me. We're going to start in the 1700s, and we are going to work our way to modern times. I ask that you would stick with me because this is very important. So there's 2 types, generally speaking, of premillennialism or futurism. There's historicist and then dispensationalist. Pre-1700, most people were historicist premillennialists that weren't all millennialists or some version of preterism, partial preterism, or post-millennialist. So that's where I'm going to start in the 1700s, but it's the same thing. Men leading people to believe that current events are for sure revelatory or revelation prophetic events. Nearly all historicists who interpreted Revelation historically claimed 1,260 day years, 538 AD, to 1798 to 1815 AD, they expected a literal personal return of Christ and a future earthly millennial reign after the final destruction of the Antichrist system, and that being the papal system. They repeatedly and explicitly declared in sermons, book, and pamphlet that, quote, "We are living in the last days, the time of the end." Daniel 12. The signs of the time show biblical prophecy is being fulfilled right before our eyes. The vials or trumpets, seals of revelation are currently being poured out. The advent of Christ is at the doors, imminent, often, quote, "in this generation," end quote, or, quote, "very shortly," end quote. The world is either already in or about to fully enter the final judgment, great tribulation, quote, "time of trouble," end quote, that immediately precedes the second coming and millennium. At that time, the explosive trigger was the French Revolution, 1789 to 1799. In its aftermath, the deposition of the Pope in 1798, rise of Napoleon, revolutionary wars across Europe. These were overwhelmingly interpreted as the great political earthquake of Revelation 11:13, the fall of the, quote, 10th part of the city, end quote, the 6th and 7th vials being poured out, the deadly wound to the beast, 1798, the drying up of the Euphrates, sometimes linked to the Ottoman decline, but mainly the collapse of papal monarchical power in France, the final overthrow of the Antichrist system. Hundreds of sermons and over 100 published books, pamphlets appeared in Britain alone between 1793 and 1815, making exactly these claims. The highest concentration of, quote, "we are in the last days, tribulation," end quote, literature until the late 20th century. Now I'll go through some men, their work, and their quotes from the 1700s to modern times. We got Edward King, who lived from 1735 to 1807. He was a prophetic writer. His major works, Remarks on the Signs of the Times. He had multiple editions, which you'll find many of these books had multiple editions because they had to continue to keep adjusting to match current events whenever their previous prophetic books failed to come to fruition. So Edwards claimed the French Revolution and the 1798 capture of the Pope marked the termination of the 1,260 years and the deadly wound to the beast. The present events are clear signs that the second coming is immediately at hand. The apocalyptic prophecies are now visibly fulfilling. We are in the last days. Quote, the signs of the times are so plain that he may run that readeth. End quote. We got James Bacino. In 1799, he wrote The Signs of the Times. His claims, the French Revolution is the commencement of the overthrow of papal tyranny and the vials of wrath. We are in the period of the sixth vial. The, quote, signs of the times prove the destruction of popery and despotism is at hand. The millennium is very near. Christ's advent will follow soon after these judgments. Directly states the events in France are, quote, dark prophecies of Scripture illustrated by the signs of the times. Next we have Granville Sharp, Joseph Priestley, Unitarian, but premill leaning, and numerous lesser Anglican Baptist clergy, like William Cooper, Thomas Reeder, J.A. Knight, all published similar pamphlets in 1794 to 1798, declaring the revolution, the sixth vial, and the fall of the Antichrist beginning now. We got George Stanley Faber, 1773 to 1854. He was an Anglican clergyman. His major works, Dissertation on the Prophecies, 1806, massively expanded in 1808, 1811, 1814, 1818, and 1844 editions. Again, remember, they kept having to rewrite these editions to make it fit whatever new current events were happening, since the previous prophetic predictions turned out to be false. His claims, the French Revolution equals the great earthquake of the 10th part of the city, Revelation 11. The vials are now pouring out. Napoleon, infidel France, is the atheist 10th horn, the beast from the bottomless pit. The 1260 years ended, like I said before, the death of the papal. We are in the, quote, time of the end. The seventh vial is commencing or imminent. The restoration of the Jews and second advent are at the very threshold. Repeatedly insists the Lord is, quote, very near, end quote. Events prove, quote, the great crisis is rapidly approaching, end quote. His books sold widely and were constantly reprinted because people believed he was documenting prophecy happening in real time. Interesting. You'll find that these guys sold lots of books, right? Just like today, it may not be books. In some cases, it is books, but most cases it's clicks, right? So I would caution you about the people that are leading you, getting all these clicks and getting you to put your hope in a false hope. Next, we have Joseph Galloway, American loyalist living in Britain. He wrote commentaries on Revelation, 1802 and 1809. His claims, Napoleon is the beast, Antichrist. Current wars are the final apocalyptic conflict. The advent is near. Next, we got William Ettrick, Anglican, 1800s to 1810, wrote works on the sixth vial being poured out currently in France. Next, we got John Aquila Brown, published in 1810 and 1823. His early works identify the 1260 years ending soon, but later, 1823, becomes one of the first to suggest a future, final 7-year tribulation after the church age. But In the early 1810s, he still followed the standard historicists. Quote, "We are now in it now." End quote. Let me repeat that. Quote, "We are now in it now." End quote. Because they were wrong before, but we're now in it now. And then a couple years from then, we're now in it now. And then again, because they need to sell a new book, they'll be like, well, we're now in it now. Let's continue. We got Lewis Way, Hugh McNeil, Henry Drummond, pre-Albury writings, and many Anglican evangelicals at London Society for Promoting Christianity Amongst Jews, founded 1809, preached that the, quote, signs of the times, end quote, French wars, Jewish condition, Ottoman decline, showed the last days had arrived and Christ's return was imminent. Scores of others, e.g., Archibald Mason, James Freer, John Bayford, William Cunningham, etc., published almost identical interpretations between 1805 and 1825, all declaring the vials are pouring, the Advent is at hand, and current events are the final signs. This wave directly fed into the Albury Park Powerscourt prophetic conferences, 1826 to 1833, and Irving Darby. Now we're going to get into some of your more common names that you've probably heard before, but like I said, this is not new, right? And they created the modern version that many are teaching and preaching today, but they're not the first to get people to think modern events are for sure revelation events happening in real time. Get ready. Christ's return right around the corner. Because many Christians have been led astray, have left the church, have lost their hope and their faith because of teachers and preachers and influencers long before they had the internet or YouTube. And I love you, and I do not want that to happen to you. So please, I'm not trying to convert you to anything. I just want you to be educated should your beliefs fail, that you'll know the other interpretations, so that way you will not lose hope and you won't lose faith. At these prophetic conferences, they would say things like, quote, "We are now in the vials," end quote. To futurist, quote, "The tribulation is entirely future but imminent," around the late 1820s. This is when the traditional historicist premillennialism started to transfer to the modern-day dispensationalist premillennialism. Both futurism, both claiming that all of the destroyed temple and prophetic events that happened in the first few centuries had nothing to do with Revelation, and that all of those events are in the future. That's basically what a futurist is. You believe that no prophecy was fulfilled in the first centuries. You think it all applies to us today or to those in the future. The distinctive features of a pre-tribulation rapture of the church, a literal future 7-year tribulation focused on Israel, a sharp Israel church distinction, and a futuristic interpretation of Daniel's 70th week and most of Revelation. It really only emerged in the late 1820s. It was totally different than the historicists' version of premillennialism, but it was solidified in the 1830s through figures associated with the Plymouth Brethren and early prophetic conferences. They claimed things such as the American Revolution, French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, the 1755 Lisbon earthquakes, lingering cultural impact as signs of the end times or tribulation. Most evangelicals of this era were postmillennial or all-millennial, expecting improvement or symbolic fulfillment rather than an imminent pre-trib rapture and literal tribulation. Between 1826 and 1875 is the era when dispensational premillennialism was born and rapidly spread among the Plymouth Brethren and early prophetic conference attendees. They repeatedly claimed the rapture was imminent any moment and the tribulation would immediately follow, citing apostate state of Christendom, moral decay, political revolutions, and the quote, signs of the times, end quote, as evidence that the church age was closing. Some key figures from that era: Edward Irving. He was a Scottish preacher from 1792 to 1834. He was a forerunner, proto-dispensational, shifted to pre-trib by 1830. His claims from the mid-1820s onward, especially in his 1828 lectures on the apocalypse in his journal, The Morning Watch, 1829 to 1833, Irving proclaimed that, quote, the last days, end quote, had arrived, the second coming was imminent, and the tribulation was approaching or beginning. He expected the church to be raptured before the worst of it, but saw current events as the, quote, beginning of sorrows, end quote. Political convulsions and revolutions across Europe, post-Napoleonic unrest, the Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 1830, July Revolution in France, 1830, earthquakes, famines, wars as literal signs, moral decay and apostasy in the church, the outbreak of charismatic gifts in his own congregation, 1830, 1831, as the, quote, latter rain, end quote, sign of the end. His Morning Watch articles repeatedly state, quote, the Lord is at hand, end quote, and tribulation near. Now we got John Nelson Darby, someone you've probably heard about. Some accusations, which I don't think are founded, that he's the one who created this, because he's not technically the one who created it. Many men before him attributed current events to prophetic events and led many people astray. He may be one of the founders of our modern version of premillennialism, with many of the Israel Jewish ties to it, but he is not the originator. There was many who came before and many who came after, many who also laid the foundation for these interpretations and doctrines that ultimately continue to this day to lead people astray. All the way up until his death, Darby taught that the rapture was, quote, imminent, end quote, and could happen at any moment, with the tribulation to follow immediately after. He frequently said the coming of the Lord was, quote, very near, or, quote, at the doors, end quote, and that current events proved the dispensation was closing. The events he cited as evidence: rapid apostasy in the professing church, rise of ritualism, Oxford movement, rationalism, infidelity, decline of the Protestant church, political revolutions, especially the European revolutions of 1830 and 1848, which he called, quote, the beginning of the end of the times of the Gentiles, end quote. Moral decay and the increase of evil in society, the condition of the Jews as evidence the, quote, times of the Gentiles, end quote, were nearing fulfillment. In 1850, he wrote a letter, quote, I look for the Lord moment by moment, end quote. And in the 1870s, he still expected it in his lifetime, saying events confirmed it. Darby's letters and tracts like, quote, The Hopes of the Church of God, 1840, and, quote, The Apostasy of the Succession, end quote. There were many other Plymouth Brethren, early dispensational conference attendees, 1826 to 1875, Albury Park Powers Court conferences, 1826 to 1833, attended by Henry Drummond, Joseph Wolfe, etc. Their claims: the prophetic conferences concluded the advent was, quote, near, end quote, and the tribulation imminent. The events cited general, quote, signs of the times, end quote, wars, distress of the nations, Jewish condition, church apostasy. Joseph Wolfe, missionary, preached globally in the 1830s to 1840s that the Ottoman decay meant tribulation near, linked to, quote, drying up of the Euphrates in Revelation. Many Brethren publications, e.g. the Christian Witness, echoed Darby's views throughout the period. We're now moving on to 1826 to 1850. This is the prophetic conferences era and the birth of futurist dispensationalism. This is when the old historicist version started to die out, and there was an explosion of the premillennialism that we see today, usually called dispensationalist. But most people who even claim to not be dispensationalist have dispensationalist doctrines, not historicist doctrines. And like I keep saying, most people don't even understand their own eschatological position, much less all the other positions. That's why I'm so adamant on just trying to educate, not convert, my brethren. During this period of time, the Albury Park and Powers Court prophetic conferences were the epicenter. Daily meetings for years where attendees concluded that practically all of Revelation from chapter 4 onward was still future. The rapture was pre-tribulational and imminent, and current events proved the church age was ending and the tribulation was at the door. Almost every speaker and attendee published or preached that, quote, the advent is at hand, end quote, and, quote, we are in the last days, end quote. And contemporary signs showed prophecy was on the verge of final fulfillment. Sound familiar? We got Henry Drummond. He was a banker, and he was a host at the Albury conferences. He published dialogues and letters from Albury in the 1830s, sponsored countless prophetic tracts. His claims, 1826 onward, he declared the second coming, quote, most near, end quote. The church was in the Laodicean apostasy. The seals, trumpets, vials were about to commence in full. The restoration of Israel was the beginning, and the tribulation would follow immediately after the rapture. Repeatedly said, quote, the signs of the times indicate that the coming of the Lord draweth nigh, end quote, and that 1847 would be a critical year. He later adjusted that, but never stopped expecting it soon. The events he cited, Ottoman decline, drying up of the Euphrates, Jewish return movements. He actually personally funded Jewish settlement efforts. Sound familiar? European political unrest, 1830, 1848 revolutions seen as precursors, the rise of Tractarianism in the Church of England as the Great Apostasy. We got Edward Irving again. His peak activity was 1826 to 1834, intensified claims in this period. His journal, The Morning Watch, was entirely devoted to proving, quote, we are in the last days, end quote. The seals were opening. The latter rain had come. His charismatic outbreaks in the tribulation would begin within a few years at most. The events he cited, 1830 revolutions, his own, quote, manifestation of the Spirit, end quote, as the sign, earthquakes, cholera pandemics, 1831 to 1832, and the, quote, spirit of the Antichrist in rationalism and popery. Again, we have John Darby. First public futurist statements at Powers Court, 1831 to 1833, constantly asserted the rapture was, quote, at any moment, end quote. The tribulation would immediately follow, and current events proved, quote, the night is far spent. Events cited, apostasy in the churches, Oxford movement as, quote, the mystery of iniquity, end quote, fully revealed. 1848 revolutions as the death throes of Gentile power, Jewish colonization efforts, spread of infidelity and socialism. Next, we have our first female, Lady Theodosia Powers Court, host of the Powers Court conferences, published letters and memoirs, show she lived in daily expectation, telling friends, quote, the Lord is at hand, end quote, and that the conferences proved the tribulation was future but imminent. We got Samuel Prideaux Tregelles, initially a futurist at Albury Powers Court, but later reverted to historicism, but in this period preached imminent advent. John Aquila Brown wrote a book called The Eventide, one of the very first to clearly separate a future final 7-year tribulation after the rapture. William Berg, Joseph Tyso, and others at the Albury all published works declaring the advent, quote, immediately at hand. We got George Faber, continued publishing new editions through the 1840s, updated his works to say the 1848 revolutions proved the seventh vial was actually commencing now, not before, claiming, quote, the great crisis is even at the doors, end quote. We got William Cunningham, 1787 to 1849. He had major works through the 1830s and 1840s, insisting the 1,260 years ended in 1792 to 1798. The French Revolution was still unfolding into the final vials, and the advent was, quote, very near. Next, we got Matthew Habershon, 1830s to 1840s publications, same line, vials pouring out in current politics. We got Archibald Mason, John Fry, Thomas White, James Hatley Freer, who calculated exact dates around 1847, 1866, but always insisted, quote, the signs show we are in the time of the end. Richard Pope, Hugh McNeill, both preached at St. Jude's, Liverpool, that 1848 revolutions were apocalyptic judgments in the Lord's return, quote, nigh, even at the doors, end quote. This 25-year window produced more imminent tribulation, advent at hand literature than any period since the 1790s French Revolution surge. The prophetic conferences created a feedback loop where everyone was reinforcing everyone else that the signs were unmistakable and the Lord was coming, quote, quickly, end quote. Sound familiar? The age of technology, the internet, YouTube, and all the social media is doing the exact same thing. It's creating a feedback loop, reinforcing everyone's position that current events are for sure the fulfilling of prophecy. And the reason I'm telling you these things is so you don't put your faith, all of your faith, in one basket. Understand the other interpretations, the interpretations that claim history shows a lot of prophecy, if not most prophecy, was fulfilled in the early centuries. And that these modern futurist doctrines could be built specifically by the chief of all liars to set you up to have your faith destroyed in the upcoming psychological operations. And because I love you, I don't care if you call me a heretic, that I've lost my mind, that I'm deceived, right? I just want to educate you so that you don't have your faith destroyed. By the 1850s, the futurist dispensationalist system had completely eclipsed historicism amongst the most vocal premillennial groups. The pre-tribulation rapture plus literal future 7-year tribulation plus restoration of Israel as the central time clock become the standard framework. Darby's multiple transatlantic tours, 1862 to 1877, exported the system to North America, where it took root explosively through Bible conferences, journals, and new prophetic magazines. Practically every major speaker and writer in this period declared in print and pulpit the rapture is, quote, at any moment, even at the doors. The tribulation will begin immediately after. The national restoration of Israel and Jewish return to Palestine is the greatest sign that we are in the last days, far more important than wars, apostasy, or natural disasters. Current events are literally staging Ezekiel 37-39, Zechariah 12-14, Daniel 11-12, in the, quote, road to Armageddon, end quote. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, Suez Canal, 1869, European turmoil, 1866 to 1871, Franco-Prussian War, Italian unification completing the, quote, wounding of the papacy, rise of Russia, and especially accelerating Jewish Zionist developments were constantly cited as proof that prophecy was leaping off the pages. Sound familiar again? Yeah. Again, we got John Darby. In his later writings and American tours, he became even more emphatic. The church is in ruins. The rapture was moment by moment, and the tribulation was, quote, imminent. He wrote in the 1870s that the Jewish colonization of societies and easing of Ottoman restrictions proved, quote, the fig tree is putting forth leaves, end quote, Matthew 24:32, and, quote, the times of the Gentiles are just closing, end quote. He had specific Israel connections, celebrated Moses Montefiore's and Charles Henry Churchill's efforts, the founding of agricultural schools in Palestine, and the first modern Jewish settlements, saw the 1878 Berlin Congress, which granted Jews rights in the Balkans and implicitly opened Palestine as divine preparation for Ezekiel's prophecy. I need you to understand that the people that you see on these social media accounts and these preachers and teachers are not the first one to attribute various prophecies to Israel, right? And allow Israel to get away with whatever Israel wants to get away with because of some sort of twisted false doctrine. Understand, centuries of men that came before us have claimed the same things and have been wrong, and led untold numbers of people to give up their faith, to stop going to church, and lose hope altogether. James H. Brooks, 1830 to 1897. He was an American Presbyterian, quote, father of American dispensationalism, pastor of the Niagara Conferences. He wrote the books Maranatha, multiple editions again, Israel in the Church, countless articles in the Truth magazine, which he edited from 1875 to 1897. His claims, quote, the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. The signs all converge towards one point, the personal return of Christ, end quote. Repeatedly preached that, quote, we are evidently on the eve of the great tribulation, end quote. The events he used, Crimean War equals Russia beginning her march southward, Ezekiel 38. Suez Canal equals preparation for the kings of the east, Revelation 16:12. 1878 Berlin Treaty and First Aliyah precursors equals the dry bones of Ezekiel 37 are stirring. The Zionist movement, even pre-Herzl, was the building of the fig tree. Rise of anti-Semitism in Russia, 1881 pogroms as the divine goad driving Jews back to the land. Again, note that modern teachers, preachers, and influencers are not the first to claim that the hatred towards the Jews, and just for clarity, I have bloodlines that go back to a place that used to be called the Jewish Paradise in Poland. So I have a personal connection to this. I no longer hold pride in that bloodline now that I have been awakened to the truth. But nonetheless, I do have a personal connection to this. So it's not just, whatever names you want to call me or associate me with various characters from the past or political groups. William Blackstone, 1841 to 1935, declared the Jewish return the greatest sign of the imminent rapture and tribulation. Personally visited Palestine multiple times, funded Jewish agricultural colonies, and in 1888-1891 preached nationwide that, quote, the times of the Gentiles are fulfilling, and Israel's restoration is at the door. Next, we got Judson Gordon, 1836 to 1895, Baptist, Moody's associate. His books were The Holy Spirit and Missions, articles in the Watchword, constantly preached, quote, the night is far spent, end quote, and that Jewish movements proved, quote, we are in the toe section of Nebuchadnezzar's image. The revived Roman Empire and the tribulation were imminent. We got Nathaniel West, 1826-1906, leading American prophetic conference speaker. Major work, The 1,000 Years in Both Testaments, 1880. Quote, "We stand on the threshold of tribulation," end quote. The return of the Jews was, quote, "the most conspicuous sign of the Advent is near." We got Arno C. Gabelain, 1861-1945. Early issues of Our Hope magazine, founded in 1894, hammered that the Zionist congresses and Jewish immigration waves were, quote, "the fig tree leaves." The clock of prophecy has started ticking again for Israel. The rapture must be very near. We got Joseph A. Seiss, 1823-1904, Lutheran dispensationalist. His books, the Apocalypse Lecture Series. Quote, "We are living in the epilogue of this dispensation. The tribulation is ready to burst upon the world." He saw the Russian expansion, Suez, and Jewish land purchases as direct fulfillment. We got Henry Morehouse, A.J. Gordon, George C. Needham, L.W. Munhall, and the entire Niagara Bible Conference Creed, 1878 onward, annually declared in their published statements, quote, "We believe the Lord Jesus is coming in person to introduce the millennial age. The world is rapidly ripening for judgment. The return of the Lord to the earth is imminent after the restoration of Israel." Horatius Bonar, I didn't make up that name. Charles Spurgeon, quote, "The Jew is the surest sign," end quote. The fig tree budding, and, quote, "we may be on the eve of Armageddon," end quote. Grattan Guinness, updated historicists' calculations, but by 1880s adopted much futurist language about Jewish restoration. William Heckler, chaplain to the British Embassy in Vienna, close friend to Theodore Herzl from 1896, preached in prophetic circles that Zionism was divine proof the tribulation was at hand. British Brethren writers Robert Anderson, Walter Scott, William Kelly all repeatedly stated in their journals that 19th century Jewish emancipation, agricultural settlements, Petah Tikva founded in 1878, Rishon LeZion 1882, and I'm not going to try to pronounce that, Zion movement were the unmistakable budding of the fig tree, and that therefore the church's removal and the tribulation were, quote, "very near indeed," end quote. This 50-year period marks the moment when, quote, "watching Israel," end quote, became the central prophetic sign for dispensationalists. Virtually every conference, sermon, or magazine article mentioned the latest Jewish immigration statistics or Zionist meeting or fresh evidence that, quote, "the Lord is at hand," end quote. Again, does this all sound familiar? Moving on to 1900 to 1950. World War I, 1914 to 1918, widely identified as Armageddon itself or its immediate precursor. The Balfour Declaration, 1917, and the British Mandate, literal fulfillment of, quote, "the fig tree budding." Rise of Zionism in massive Aliyah waves, third, fourth, and fifth Aliyah. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct, but either way, you get the point. Hitler and the Holocaust, the, quote, "time of Jacob's trouble," end quote. Jeremiah 37, happening in real time. Founding of the State of Israel, 1948, the absolute super sign that sealed it for an entire generation, created a perfect storm. Almost every single prominent premillennial teacher of the era went on record in books, sermons, radio broadcasts, magazines, declaring that the tribulation events were either already underway or would begin within a few years at most. The phrase, quote, "this generation shall not pass away till all these things be fulfilled," end quote, Matthew 24:34, was quoted constantly, with 1917 or 1948 as the starting point. Again, you'll notice over these centuries, they just keep changing the dates. They keep changing the formulas. Much similar to whether it's evolution math or space math. As soon as it's proven wrong, what do? They just add in some more numbers, they make the math fit, and then move on. And then as soon as it's proven wrong again, they just add in some years, some miles, whatever it may be, and then it just stretches out the math. They come up with a new formula, and voila, we got a new perfect formula that's going to be proven wrong in like a year. And just so you know, this list could be tripled or even more. These are just the most influential. Arno C. Gabelain, 1861 to 1945, editor of Our Hope. From 1917 onward, he declared in virtually every issue, quote, "The fig tree has put forth her leaves. Balfour was the greatest sign since Pentecost. The Jewish national restoration proved we are standing on the very threshold of tribulation." By the 1930s, he was saying Hitler was preparing the way for the Antichrist and that, quote, "the great tribulation for Israel has already begun." In 1943, 1944, he wrote that the Holocaust was Jeremiah 37 in real time and that, quote, "the Lord must come very soon now," end quote. James M. Gray, Moody Bible Institute president, 1904 to 1934, repeatedly taught that World War I was the final war before Armageddon. Balfour was God's signature on prophecy, and we are evidently belong to the generation that shall not pass away until it is all fulfilled, end quote. Are you starting to see the pattern yet? I hope so, because I love you, and I do not want you to be deceived by these clickbaiters and those who are building their prophecy from a deceived perception without teaching you all of the positions and other interpretations. I don't care if you believe what you're going to believe, but if you are teaching people that this is the only eschatology and the only accepted interpretation of prophetic events, you are misleading them and potentially setting them up to have their faiths destroyed. Maybe even be convinced that their entire faith was built on a lie in the first place, which is what our enemies accuse us of all the time. We got Harry A. Ironside, 1886 to 1951, pastor at Moody Church. His books were The Lamp of Prophecy, and he had countless sermons. Explicitly stated in the 1930s and 40s, the establishment of the Jewish state will be the greatest event of the age. We are living in the closing days of the church age. The tribulation is almost upon us. In 1948, he preached that Israel's rebirth was, quote, "the most outstanding sign of all," and that this generation now had biblical definition. Not the ones before. They got it wrong. The hundreds of men before him got it wrong, but not him. Not him. And that's exactly what those who are teaching you this false doctrine, in my opinion, right? And even if it's not a false doctrine, teaching people that it's the only doctrine is for sure incorrect. And teachers, you will be held to a higher standard. Understand that. We got Louis Bowman, 1875 to 1950. His books were The Light from Bible Prophecy, The Time of Jacob's Trouble. I know I've heard that before. And he had plenty of 1940s pamphlets. Declared in the late 1930s, quote, "Hitler's clearing the way for the Antichrist. We are in the time of Jacob's trouble." After 1948, he wrote, quote, "May 14th, 1948 is the greatest date in prophetic history since AD 70. The fig tree has bloomed. The Lord is at the door." Was it? Next, we got Keith Brooks, Prophecy Monthly editor. Every single year from 1917 to 1948, the magazine led with headlines like, quote, "Israel's restoration imminent, rapture next," and, quote, this generation is the generation. Charles G. Trumbull, Sunday School Times editor, 1920s to 1930s. Quote, the return of the Jew to Palestine is the greatest miracle of the age and proves we are in the last days. End quote. Wilbur Smith, Moody faculty, later Fuller. 1940s writings, quote, no intelligent student of prophecy can fail to see that the tribulation is almost here. Israel's rebirth is the terminal sign. That statement didn't age well. Louis Sperry Chafer, founder of Dallas Theological Seminary, 1924, Systematic Theology, quote, the evidence that the time of the end has come is overwhelming. The restoration of Israel as a nation is the one great sign that the end of the age is upon us, end quote. John Walvoord, Chafer's successor at DTS, president, 1952 to 1986. His early books, The Rapture Question, 1954, but writings from 1940s onward. Quote, started the prophetic clock ticking louder than ever, end quote. And that, quote, this present generation would see the tribulation. Charles Feinberg, Talbot Theological Seminary, Jewish believer, 1940s to 1950s, quote, the rebirth of Israel in 1948 is the most colossal event in the past 1900 years of prophetic fulfillment. We are the terminal generation, end quote. William Pettingill, H.A. Ironside, Donald Gray, Barnhouse, radio preacher, Revelation magazine. Alva McLean, Grace Seminary founder. Herman A. Hoyt, J. Dwight Pentecost, later author of Things to Come, but active in the 1940s conferences, all on record in the 1940s saying essentially the same thing. Israel's rebirth equals super sign, rapture imminent, tribulation to begin in our lifetime. F.B. Meyer, G. Campbell Morgan, both shifted strongly toward premillennialism post-Balfour and preached it was the greatest sign. Sidlow Baxter, Arthur W. Pink, in his later studies in the scriptures, repeatedly said the Jewish signs proved, quote, the coming of the Lord draweth nigh, exceedingly, end quote. Many who had been slightly more cautious before 1914 to 1918, like C.I. Schofield, who died in 1921, had updated their reference Bibles constantly, reprinted with notes pointing to contemporary events as fulfillment. The sheer volume is staggering. Every major Bible conference, Niagara, successors, Philadelphia Prophetic Conference, etc., every fundamentalist magazine, every Moody radio broadcast from the 1920s through the early 1950s hammered the same message. 1948 sealed it. This generation, now defined, shall not pass. The tribulation is at hand. After 1950, the claims continued, but the intensity shifted slightly as people had to adjust the, quote, this generation math. Again, they just have to keep adjusting. I've researched this before when I was going through my own exploration of my faith and trying to figure out in spirit, in faith, what the proper interpretation was. But I've never done this deep of a dive. I did this for you. I did it again. But I was genuinely shocked when I went this deep. It is absolutely crazy. These are starters of seminaries and Bible colleges, people who lead radio stations, and just generalized leaders, heroes of the faith, some would call them. Many of these guys' books, audiobooks, writings, sermons, I've listened to thousands of hours of. And it's just baffling how they can continue century after century making the same claims and not correcting. It makes sense to me why there's so many logical and rationalists today, right? Where that they believe in science and man's history, and they look at scripture through those things. It's because of centuries of men making wild claims about current events being prophetic fulfillments. Moving on to 1950 to 1988, that's a big year. The Terminal Generation Era, Holocaust Aftermath, Israel's Wars, Cold War, and the 1988 Countdown. The phrase, quote, the time of Jacob's trouble, how often do you hear that? Jeremiah 37 became the single most repeated prophetic tagline for the coming 7-year tribulation, invoked in almost every book, sermon, and conference as proof that the events happening to the Jews in Israel were the final birth pangs. The Holocaust was overwhelmingly interpreted as the opening phase or immediate precursor to Jacob's trouble. Not the full thing, since the Antichrist hadn't been revealed and the temple wasn't rebuilt. Israel's Wars, 1956, 1967, 1973, recapture of Jerusalem, and the rising global anti-Semitism were seen as God driving the Jews into the land so the full, quote, time of Jacob's trouble could commence right after the rapture. By the 1980s and 1948 plus one generation, 40 years, equals 1988, math produced the most intense wave of, quote, the tribulation starts any day now claims since 1948 itself. John F. Walvoord, 1910 to 2002, Dallas Theological Seminary president, 1952 to 1986, the most academically respected dispensational voice of the era. His books were Israel in Prophecy, 1962, The Nations in Prophecy, 1967, The Blessed Hope in the Tribulation, 1976, Armageddon, Oil in the Middle East Crisis, 1974, revised in 1990, selling over 1 million copies during the Gulf War. You're starting to see a pattern with that too. People get clicks, they get subscriptions, sell millions of books, lead seminaries, but they also lead untold numbers to lead the church when all of these things don't come to fruition. This is why I emphasize how important it is to understand all eschatology positions. That way, if yours turns out to be incorrect, you won't be able to be easily deceived in the upcoming planned deceptions. Many think they won't be deceived, and many people online are teaching that certain things are the deceptions to look for. But what happens if they're wrong? Then you won't know what to see. You don't know what to look for, and you may very well be one of those ones who's led astray. Because of my opinion, the scripture that refers to the elect not being able to be deceived was written to a specific audience during a specific period of time. Revelation 20, if we are in that, it doesn't have any exclusions for the elect. It simply says, deceive the nations, as in all the nations, all the elect, everyone. And the fact that most of us have believed in outer space, and some of us still do, proves that we can, in fact, be deceived on a very foundational level. That man repeatedly taught that, quote, the time of Jacob's trouble equals the future 7-year tribulation, but that the Holocaust and Arab wars against Israel were God's preparation for it. In the 1950s to 1960s, he wrote that the Holocaust foreshadowed Jacob's trouble and that Israel's rebirth meant, quote, we are entering the outer circle of the events leading to Jacob's trouble. Post-1967 Six-Day War, quote, the recapture of Jerusalem in 1967 is the greatest prophetic event since Pentecost. The stage is now fully set for the time of Jacob's trouble. 1973, Yom Kippur War and oil crisis, updated his books to say these proved, quote, Jacob's trouble is immediately ahead. The Antichrist treaty with Israel could be signed any day. J. Dwight Pentecost, 1915 to 2014, Dallas professor, explicitly defined the entire tribulation as, quote, the time of Jacob's trouble, end quote. In chapter after chapter, stating the Holocaust and post-war pogroms were God's rod to drive Israel back to the land so the full trouble could begin. 1967, quote, Jerusalem is no longer trodden down of the Gentiles, Luke 21:24. The time of Jacob's trouble is at hand, end quote. Hal Lindsey, best-selling prophecy writer of all time. He wrote The Late Great Planet Earth, 1970. Over 15 million copies sold by the 1980s. He devotes page after page to explaining the future tribulation as, quote, the time of Jacob's trouble, end quote, saying the Holocaust was only a, quote, preview. The real one will be far worse when the Antichrist turns on Israel. Ties 1967 Jerusalem recapture to Matthew 24:15 to 21, and says, quote, this generation, starting 1948 or 1967, will see Jacob's trouble. Later books, There's a New World Coming in 1973, the 1980s Countdown to Armageddon, 1981, quote, we are the generation that will see the time of Jacob's trouble. The countdown has begun, end quote. Tim LaHaye, 1926 to 2016, and Jerry Jenkins, Left Behind series precursors. LaHaye's early books, The Beginning of the End, 1972, quote, the time of Jacob's trouble is racing towards us. Israel's wars prove it. Explicitly links 1967 to the start of the final countdown. Dave Hunt, 1926 to 2013, Global Peace and the Rise of the Antichrist, 1980s to 1990s. The Holocaust was the birth pangs. The real, quote, time of Jacob's trouble, end quote, comes when Israel signs a peace treaty. He speculated European Community, UN. Jack Van Imp, 1930 to 2020, TV prophet. From the 1970s to 1980s, constantly screamed on air, quote, we are entering the time of Jacob's trouble. The Holocaust was bad, but the Bible says we've been coming in trouble for Jacob will be worse than anything in history. Never heard that before. It's the first time anybody in history has said that. Okay, moving on. Forgive me, Lord. Next up, Edgar Wisnant, 1932 to 2001. The 1988 Phenomena. 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988. Sold 4.5 million copies. Quote, the time of Jacob's trouble begins in 1988. Israel's 40 years old. The generation is ending. End quote. When it failed, he issued, quote, 89 reasons for 1989. You can't really make this stuff up. It's insane. Grant Jeffrey, Chuck Missler, Marvin Rosenthal. I used to love Chuck Missler. I listened to him all the time. I still remember many of his teachings. I just couldn't believe that he was a premillennialist with that vast of knowledge. But you have to understand, he also worked for the computer industry. He was one of the original people at IBM and those companies, you know, the ones that sold computers for $666.66 and such. You know, it's a big club, and I don't want to accuse anybody of being in it without knowing for sure, but I know it's a big club, and many of us aren't in it. Pre-wrath, but still used the phrase. Zola Levitt, Wim Malgo, Joseph Chambers, Perry Stone, early ministry, and dozens of others on radio all hammered the same line. Jacob's trouble. Jacob's trouble. Jacob's trouble, we're in it. Jacob's trouble's coming. It's this generation. Louis Bowman died in 1950, but his writings reprinted heavily in the 1950s. His 1938 pamphlet, The Time of Jacob's Trouble, was recirculated widely, claiming Hitler was preparing the way for the Antichrist and the trouble had essentially begun. Gerald Stanton, kept from the hour 1950s. Quote, "The Holocaust is the beginning of the birth pangs leading directly into the time of Jacob's trouble." End quote. Arthur Pink, I used to read his books all the time, earlier but reprinted, and Harry Ironside, books still in print. Both had called rising circulation calling the coming trouble, quote, Jacob's trouble. M.R. DeHaan, Radio Bible Class, 1950s broadcasts, quote, "The Jews are heading into the time of Jacob's trouble. Watch Israel." Again, if somebody is teaching you this, understand 3 centuries of men have said the exact same things. So be careful who you're being taught by. Billy Graham crusades in the 1960s to 1970s often quoted dispensational teachers saying, quote, "The time of Jacob's trouble is near," when discussing Israel. The 1967 Six-Day War produced an absolute explosion of books and sermons titled or subtitled, quote, "The time of Jacob's trouble is near," or "Jacob's trouble approaches," end quote. Many pastors literally preached the war as the possible start of the tribulation itself. Jerusalem's recapture equals the time of the Gentiles fulfilled. Temple rebuilds possible. Antichrist, then we got Jacob's trouble. Same with 1973 Yom Kippur War, seen as further evidence the trouble was intensifying. By 1988, the phrase was so ubiquitous, every prophecy conference, every issue of Prophecy Watch type magazines led with, quote, "Is this the beginning of Jacob's trouble?" I don't know, we'll find out. This era turned, quote, "the time of Jacob's trouble" into a household evangelical language more than any other phrase except maybe, quote, "rapture," end quote, itself. Moving on to the next 50 years, 1989 to 2025. We're going to wrap it up, but it gets crazy right now because of the internet and all these things. We got the post-1988 recalibrations, seeing that the 1988 thing fell through. Peace treaties, 9/11, blood moons, Abraham Accords, or like Trump likes to say, the Abraham Accords, COVID, and October 7th, 2023. Quote, "Jacob's trouble has begun." Explosion. The failure of 1988 produced no retreat, only recalibration again. The dominant new formulas became, quote, "A biblical generation equals 70 to 80 years, Psalm 90 to 10. 1948 plus 80 equals 2028 max, or 1967 plus 70 to 80 equals 2037 to 2047. Notice how they just keep stretching out the math like it's space science. Or, quote, "The season of the Lord's return," quote, "began in 1948 to 1967, but the tribulation countdown truly started with later events, Jerusalem embassy, Abraham Accords, etc. Every major Middle East crisis from 1991 onward has been declared by multiple voices as either the literal start of the tribulation or the immediate prelude to Jacob's trouble. The phrase, quote, "the time of Jacob's trouble," end quote, reached peak usage in this era, invoked thousands of times on YouTube, podcasts, and conferences as the exact description of what Israel is currently experiencing or about to experience. The internet and prophecy YouTube, 2008 onward, amplified everything exponentially. Millions of views on videos titled, quote, "Jacob's trouble has begun," after every new crisis. Hal Lindsey continued active until 2025 via TV and books. 1990s to the 2000s, his books Planet Earth 2000, Apocalypse Code 1997, The Final Battle, adjusted again to say 1988 was a near miss, but, quote, we are deeper into the birth pangs, end quote. The Oslo Accords, 1993, where the Antichrist's covenant with Israel, Dan 927, post 9/11, quote, Islam is the final Antichrist system. Jacob's trouble is about to explode, end quote. 2023 to 2025, on his show repeatedly said October 7th was, quote, the opening salvo of Jacob's trouble, end quote, and that Iran's attacks prove, quote, we are watching Jeremiah 37 unfold in real time. Tim LaHaye until 2016 and Jerry Jenkins, Left Behind series 1995 to 2007, 80 million copies, presented the rapture and tribulation, explicitly called, quote, the time of Jacob's trouble, end quote, throughout the books as happening in the very near future, with events mirroring 1990s headlines, UN, EU, Russia, Israel peace deals. The cultural impact was massive. Mainstream media constantly asked if current events were, quote, left behind coming true. Next up, John Hagee, Cornerstone Church, Christians United for Israel, books, Jerusalem Countdown, 2006, Four Blood Moons, 2013, sold millions, Earth's Final Moments, 2010s, explicitly taught that the coming 7-year tribulation is, quote, the time of Jacob's trouble, end quote. 2014 to 2015, Blood Moons, quote, God is screaming at the world. Jacob's trouble is upon us, end quote. Post October 7, 2023, multiple sermons declaring, quote, Jacob's trouble began on October 7, 2023. Israel is now in the furnace of affliction spoken of by Jeremiah. Jack Van Imp, until his death in 2020. Weekly TV show for decades, ended almost every broadcast with, quote, the time of Jacob's trouble is almost here, end quote. 1990s, Oslo era, quote, the peace treaty is being prepared. 2000s to 2010s, EU equals revived Roman Empire. Islam equals Antichrist. Blood moons equals final warning before Jacob's trouble. David Jeremiah, which I used to, in my early days, my first years of faith, I listened to Jeremiah obsessively. I had a subscription to his book thing. I'd get a mailer every month with a new book and all this information. Turning Point Ministry. Books. The Coming Economic Armageddon, 2010. Agents of the Apocalypse, 2014. The Book of Signs, 2019. Repeatedly calls the tribulation, quote, the time of Jacob's trouble, and says current anti-Semitism, Israel's isolation, and wars are stage setting or the early phase. Post October 7th, quote, we are witnessing the prelude to, if not the beginning of, the time of Jacob's trouble, end quote. Perry Stone, Voice of Evangelism. Hundreds of YouTube videos titled, quote, Jacob's trouble is here, or October 7th started Jacob's trouble. 2023 to 2025, quote, the time of Jacob's trouble officially began October 7th, 2023. The worst is yet to come when Antichrist confirms the covenant, but Israel is already in it. Jonathan Cahn, Messianic Rabbi, massive bestseller author. The Harbinger 2, 2020. The Return of the Gods, 2022. The Josiah Manifesto, 2023. While not strictly dispensational, repeatedly says America and Israel are entering parallel judgments and that, quote, the time of Jacob's trouble is approaching or has begun, with October 7th being a major shaking. Jan Markle, Olive Tree Ministries, Understanding the Times Radio. Every single year since the early 2000s, quote, we are racing towards the time of Jacob's trouble. 2023 to 2025, quote, Jacob's trouble began on October 7th. The church won't be here for the worst of it, but we are so close. I mean, are we closer than, the last 3 centuries of men who said we were close? Or, how close are we? It's hard to tell when 3 centuries of men, churches, presidents of seminaries have all said the same thing and all went to their graves with none of it happening. That should tell you something. Maybe take a little caution and a step back if somebody is saying any of these phrases that you have heard in this video over and over and over again. I don't say this to condemn or judge, but because I love you, and I was once under the impression that I was being taught the full Word of God. All the alternative interpretations proved that that was not true. Next up, Amir Sephardi. Behold Israel, 1 million plus YouTube subs. Israel believer, former IDF, post October 7th videos, millions of views. Quote, Jacob's trouble has started. What Hamas did on October 7th is only the birth pangs. The real trouble comes when the Antichrist makes his move. 2024 to 2025, Iran, Hezbollah escalations. Quote, we are living in the early days of Jacob's trouble right now. End quote. Jimmy Evans, Tipping Point, End Times Ministry, 2023 to 2025 episodes. Quote, October 7th was the beginning of Jacob's trouble. Israel has entered the crucible. Jeremiah prophesied. Tom Hughes, Hope for Our Times, Billy Crone, Brandy Holthus, Monkey Works, J.D. Farag, Hawaiian Pastor, Gary Stearman, Prophecy Watchers, all have multiple 2023-2025 videos explicitly titled or stating, quote, Jacob's trouble has begun, end quote, or, quote, we are now entering Jacob's trouble, in direct response to October 7th and subsequent wars. March Hitchcock, Dallas Seminary grad, author of 40-plus prophecy books. The End, 2012, Global Reset, 2022, calls tribulation, quote, the time of Jacob's trouble, and says Abraham Accords, 2020, are the Daniel 9:27 covenant in embryo. 2024, books, sermons, quote, everything's happening in Israel right now is preparing the nation for the ultimate time of Jacob's trouble. I thought we got prepared a long time ago. Greg Laurie, Harvest Crusade, post October 7th sermons, quote, Israel is in the early stages of what the Bible calls the time of Jacob's trouble. Other voices, Max Lucado, Anne Graham Lotz, Skip Heitzig, Jeff Kinley, Britt Gillette, Todd Hampson, Lee Brainerd, Bill Salas, Psalm 83 War Theory, Terry James, Rapture Ready, and literally hundreds of prophecy YouTube channels, all repeatedly declaring in 2023 to 2025 that, quote, Jacob's trouble has either begun or is on the very verge because October 7th, Hezbollah war, Iran threats, and global anti-Semitism. The volume in 2023 to 2025 is unprecedented. A Google or YouTube search for Jacob's Trouble October 7th returns thousands of sermons, videos, and articles from the past 2 years alone, making the direct claim. The pattern is crystal clear and unbroken. Every generation of premillennial believers since the late 18th century has overwhelmingly declared, based on the headlines of their day, that the final tribulation, time of Jacob's trouble, was at hand, already starting, or would begin any moment. And the chorus in November 2025 is louder than ever. I pray that you made it this far, but I just, I don't know what to say. I did the research. I was shocked. It was very, very difficult for me to get through this. I don't want a negative self-talk or say that I have some sort of mental uh, lack, but it was very, very difficult for me to get this audio recorded. I don't even know if I can physically stand up right now. Uh, but yeah, this was very difficult for me, and going back through and reading it out loud and having to hear myself say the same phrases over and over and over again. And like I said, I've done this research before, but because I love you, I went back in and I went deeper than ever. And pray, I pray this convinces you to, at the very minimum, educate yourself on the other eschatological positions. I implore you, educate yourself on short season eschatology based on Revelation 20, verse 3, as well as verse 7 through 9. There are many false accusations against short season end times interpretations, but the three foundational aspects are: 1. Christ, the apostles, and the early church teachers were not liars. Everything happened exactly the way they said it would in their lifetimes. The golden age is past, and Satan has been released. Hallel, Hasatan, the enemy, whatever you want to call him, he's out. And he's deceiving the nations. And he has been from anywhere from a couple decades to a few centuries. But I believe, and many others believe, that people are going to be tricked into believing biblical prophecy is being fulfilled and that Christ is right around the corner, just like all these other generations that have been tricked to believe the same thing. But this time, it's going to be spectacular, right? We're talking holographic tech, voice-to-skull technology, microwave technology, advanced UAP, alien invasion type stuff, right? Stuff that'll even melt the most studied of us reality, right? But no matter what comes, most of us on this side of the fence have studied all the different positions. We know all the different outcomes. So even if I am wrong and my short season brethren are wrong, we'll be prepared for whatever deceptions are coming because we know all the different positions and all the different outlooks on what's to come. So there's nothing that he could throw at us that's going to ultimately rob us of our hope, our faith, or convince us that our faith was built on lies. I've seen many truther Christians give up Christianity when they are intellectually honest about the level of deception that has got into church history, scriptures, interpretations, and such. Imagine when we are in the middle of some sort of alien, quote, alien invasion. What happens then? When you can't call your pastor or your friends, or you can't even go to church. There's no internet access, no communication. Whatever reality you have, you're going to be stuck in that reality. And if you have not educated yourself on all the various outcomes, you may very well be convinced your entire faith was just, like they accuse it of being, a man-made lie for power and control and manipulation. Okay? The enemy is going to convince humanity to go to war with these so-called bad aliens. I believe this is the only potential scenario that fits in with the plan to destroy atheists and Christians' faith simultaneously. So I just ask you to take caution listening to these premillennialist, futurist teachers, because they are not the first. They won't be the last. But I don't want you to be stuck in the wake of their false teachings, should they be incorrect, like the last 3 centuries of men who've made the exact same claims. I love you, Father. I pray that anyone who listens to this, any part of it, whether it's 30 seconds or the whole thing, which I find would be a miracle. But anyways, anybody who listens to it, even if they hate me, I pray that you bless them. If they falsely accuse me, if they hear anything in here that helps them grow, I just pray that you bless them all the way around. I thank you for your grace. I thank you for your mercy. And I thank you for your Son.